Hello everybody and welcome to the Dancing Philosophers YouTube page. Today's video will be about Arthur Schopenhauer and an introduction into his philosophy. So let's just begin right away. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in 1788 in Danzig and he passed away in 1860 in Frankfurt. The philosophy of Schopenhauer is a reaction and based off the philosophy of Immanuel Kant and the beginnings and developments of transcendental idealism. So right away, I just need to give a quick introduction to the philosophy that he was building off and reacting from, and then we'll get right into what he exactly said. Immanuel Kant's philosophy, when he published the Critique of Pure Reason in Germany in 1789, and he published it, I believe, when he was 59 years old. So Kant's philosophy at the time was groundbreaking in Germany, and what Kant had seemed to do was save the phenomenal world, the world of science, at the expense of the metaphysical world or transcendental world, the world of a priori or philosophy from pure reason. And now we're really going back to the Greeks and up to the scholastic philosophers in particular. And so what Kant had argued is that reason has a limitation in what it can know, because reason can never understand what a thing is in and of itself. Our senses give us a representation of the world, but that is not the actual world in and of itself. So I'll just take this pair of glasses here. What Kant's position is that these glasses that I'm looking at in space and time are a representation, and it's phenomenal. Phenomena is Greek for appearance. So what Kant is saying is I'm not actually experiencing the glasses outside of my perceptions and how I experience it by holding it, looking at it. I can throw them and hear them. What he's saying is I get a representation from my eyes, from these senses, and so we're not looking at reality, we're looking at a representation. How this is outside of my perceptions, quite actually I could never know. And so what Kant was saying is to think that if I put on blue sunglasses and walk around and look at the world and think it's blue, that would be ridiculous. Well, Kant's position is that that's happening with your eyes themselves, and that at every given time, for example, I know that if we had a microscope, we could zoom in on these glasses and see perhaps tons of bacteria, things that are microscopic. So we know that those are there, but we can't perceive them with the limitations of our own senses. So what Kant's position was saying is that space and time are not outside of us, they're inside of us. So Kant had this notion of a category, which he inherited from Aristotle. And he had many categories in his philosophy, and fundamentally the main ones are space and time. And so for Kant, space and time are transcendently ideal. He had this notion of the transcendental unity of a perception, and essentially that's the transcendental grounding that takes all of the perceptions and makes sense of them. And he effectively argued it's our imagination. So now we're getting into romanticism, the poetry, the inspired artists. So it's our imagination that takes all this sensory input and makes, through association, assemble with ideas. He got this idea from David Hume as well, who argued for a simple idea and a complex idea. So we have the idea of gold and a mountain, which are two simple ideas, and we combine them for a complex idea for Hume and have a golden mountain. And Kant had famously claimed that Hume's skepticism is what awoke him out of his dogmatic slumber. Dogmatism is the belief in philosophy that there's an authority that you should defer to and you should not critique. So anti-free thinking as a first principle. Kant famously as well, in What is the Enlightenment, defined enlightenment as the ability to think for yourself. So this first principle that we have in our society, sort of post-enlightenment, secular society, we should think for ourselves. We owe that to Kant and essentially other philosophers, but in terms of enunciating it in such a way, we get that from Kant. So this idea that space and time are actually not objective realities, they're actually subjective conditions for experiencing itself, is the Kantian groundbreaking claim. The idea of Einstein's relativity is very much based on these sort of ideas, that space and time are not absolutely independent of us, and that our sense of our own existence cannot be separated from them, and that our own subjectivity, which is where space and time come from as categories, actually is the grounds for all our experience. And so what Kant had argued is that I can know this pair of glasses as a phenomena, But his term of the thing in itself, or the noumena, what it is outside of my perceptions, by definition, I can't know. So this is why Kant is seen as bridging the gap between rationalism, Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, and the empiricists, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and David Hume. And so he had essentially argued that each was correct and incorrect. And what he had done is taken the correct sides of each position and abandoned the incorrect positions and morphed them into this Kantian philosophy, which is called transcendental idealism. So many philosophers after Kant had rejected this distinction. So after Kant in German idealism, the sequence is Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. And all three of them rejected this idea of the thing in itself, because they argued, what's the point of doing philosophy if all we can describe is the surface of things? That's not even philosophy in some extent. Going back to Plato, the idea of philosophy was that we should know the essence of things, the timeless essence. And Kant had hinted at the noumena being composed of the immortality of the soul, the idea of God, and free will. And so these are the ultimate metaphysical things: free will, immortality of the soul, and the idea of God, the ontological or the cosmological argument. And so he had seemed to destroy the knowledge that we could have in metaphysics, but left this ground open for faith. And now we're getting into Kant's piety, and we can go down that. And I plan to do actually another video on Kant's whole philosophy. So Fichte came after Kant, and in Fichte's critique of all revealed revelation, which he published anonymously, people thought it was Kant, and Kant had to come and say, this isn't me. I don't know who wrote this, and Fichte was forced to publicly accept his fame. So Fichte inherited the title of the main German philosopher after Kant, Schelling after Fichte, Hegel after Schelling. Fichte had argued that since Kant had seemed to lead to a kind of this transcendental unity of perception and this kind of transcendental subjectivity itself, what Fichte said is that, well, this is leading to a dualism, because if there's a thing in itself and a perception, we now have a dualism. And whenever you have a dualism in philosophy, you have the problem of interaction. So what Fichte said is, let's just get away with the idea that anything is outside of this, what he coined the absolute ego, or this transcendental ego. And what Fichte had said is that all of our knowledge is grounded in our own subjectivity. So we only know nature from our own subjectivity. Everything, the ground, he called it the science of our knowledge, the Wissenschaftslehre. What he had argued is that this absolute ego, almost this kind of cogito ergo sum, in some sense, it isn't it, but it's more in that line with philosophy, that there is this kind of ego that grounds everything. And so Fichte had led philosophy after Kant in trying to save metaphysics, possibly down the road of solipsism, or being reality only in his mind. And so Schelling after Fichte intuited something wrong with Fichte's philosophy and said, in creating what Schelling called his nature philosophy, that there's actually something outside of us that we have an intuition of, and that this subjectivity at our own awareness of our reason doesn't fulfill all of this explanation. What Schelling was trying to do was point out that Kant had seemed to basically destroy the transcendence of nature and made it just this kind of representation to us. And what Schelling was trying to do was return the German poetic tradition of the almost pantheism of nature, that nature is itself not only an expression of God's creativity, but is God creating itself. Schelling had been influenced by Spinoza and pantheism, so he was looking at this kind of objectivity outside of us as actually a reflection of invisible spirit and visible nature. So Schelling's famous quote is that nature is visible spirit and spirit is invisible nature. So Fichte and Schelling had rejected this noumena, and they had argued that, and anticipating in some sense phenomenology, they argued that our knowledge has to be not leading to this noumena, because it effectively destroys philosophy and metaphysics. It saves science and it saves the knowledge of our senses, but Kant had argued that it's not a philosophical knowledge, it's only a knowledge of appearances. And going back to Plato, we know that appearances and the phenomenal world are beliefs and opinions. So what Hegel did after Schelling was argue that both Fichte and Schelling were effectively halfway there. And what Hegel did is create what's called absolute idealism. And Hegel's argument is that the noumena as an idea does not stand up effectively. If we can't actually know what the noumena is, why would we even know it exists? And so what Hegel did is he turned this completely inside out, and he argued that the world around us, this in his phenomenology of spirit, he argued that the phenomena of the world, this appearance, is not some separate dualistic representation from our own interiority. What it is it's spirit itself, and arguing for a kind of spiritual essence to all of existence. Hegel argued that all of existence was our rationality realizing the universe and us are merging into God and becoming one substantial whole as a spiritual essence. And so Hegel had incorporated many, many philosophers, and he became the rock star of philosophy in Germany, and he was heralded. Many, many people arrived to his lectures. He used to have 100, maybe up to 200 people in his lectures. So he had Hegel's philosophy, which had gone the opposite of Kant, which had seemed to embrace everything purely beyond the physical world. Now we're getting into spiritualism and immateriality and the influence. There's a great book about Hegel and the Hermetic tradition and the occult, and how he was very much influenced by that type of thinking. Jacob Boehme. So there's many philosophical influences on Hegel. And so this is the kind of context that Schopenhauer was in as well. And Schopenhauer, unlike those three philosophers, actually maintained the Kantian thing in itself. Schopenhauer had argued that what we call the phenomenal world was in agreement with Kant, and because he was influenced by Eastern philosophy, Schopenhauer, he was the first true Western philosopher that was influenced by Eastern philosophy. He was reading translations of the Vedas and the Upanishads, which are foundational to Hinduism and Eastern philosophy. He was reading Max Muller's German translations of those in the early 19th century. So he was ahead of many other philosophers in that sense in being exposed to various ideas. And what Schopenhauer had done is that he had effectively argued that this Kantian philosophy is very much like Buddhism. And this phenomenal world is what the Buddhists call samsara. And samsara is the world of, it's a cycle or a circle, and it's all reincarnation. It's the same blob of existence just reincarnating itself over and over and over and over. And to achieve nirvana is to separate from this cycle of reincarnation and to no longer be reborn. And what Schopenhauer effectively argued is that this idea of nirvana, or this thing in itself, was effectively the noumena. In comparison, now he actually built on that itself, and what he argued is that for Schopenhauer, everything is the will. So Schopenhauer had this theory that metaphysically at the substratum of our existence is this will, and he argued the will is in everything. So we can observe it in nature, we can observe it in even vegetative plants. So Schopenhauer said all of nature is this blind will, again getting back to this Eastern influence of samsara. And he had this idea that our will we have access to, but the phenomenal world cannot see it. So our body is the phenomena, but our will is the noumena. And so for Schopenhauer, unlike Kant, there's a noumena, but we can actually know it because we are the noumena. So when I meditate or I go through introspection or I philosophically reflect, I understand the inner workings of my own metaphysical will, and therefore I can actually know the entire universe itself, because if the entire universe is will manifesting, and I'm that will and I can see my own essence, then therefore I will see the entire essence of the entire universe in existence. So in that sense, Schopenhauer was different than Kant. He was arguing that this noumena and phenomena distinction ultimately is in our mind, but at a metaphysical level, everything is one thing. And so Schopenhauer had this idea based on our will, is that we're always striving, and it's desire itself that constantly thwarts us. Again, the Eastern philosophical influences. So Schopenhauer had this famous idea, and this is where his pessimism comes in. You could argue every other Western philosopher in some sense was an optimist. Even Friedrich Nietzsche argued that one should strive, one should take their suffering and use it as a grounds to grow into the great artists of the future. Schopenhauer was actually a pessimist. Schopenhauer famously said in one of his essays, if I recall, I don't believe it was in The World as Will and Representation, he said that life is an oscillation between satisfaction and boredom. So boredom, we want something, I'm hungry, I'll go to the fridge, I eat this bit of food, I'm satisfied, I'm satiated for a while, and after a certain time I get bored and I need something else. And so what Schopenhauer said is, this is your whole life. You watch a movie, it ends, you're bored, you go do something else, it fills you up for a while. But he basically said that you're never going to be satisfied, that dissatisfaction itself is the human condition, and that the very searching for what Aristotle would call eudaimonia, or happiness, is a cursed project and will never succeed. You'll never actually achieve happiness, because once you want something, you'll want something else. We've all thought of that gift that we asked our mom, please give us this gift, I won't ask for a Christmas gift ever again, and you finally got it, and then within 3 months you were bored of it and it was in a pile and you were wanting some other new product or some other new thing. We don't even have to go capitalist criticism here. It's just a basic metaphysical, there's this void in us and we're always trying to fill it up and it'll never be filled. Schopenhauer also wrote about diversions and needing distractions, because we're aware that much like a cat, we will reflexively avoid flames or something that threatens us. So a cat, if there's a flame next to a cat, the cat will move, and so will we reflexively. But unlike the cat, we have this consciousness, this awareness of temporality. So we have past and future experiences. We can anticipate the future, and when you have past remembrances. And so Schopenhauer argued that what is the curse for us is this awareness. And so we need to distract ourselves constantly through recreation, amusement. Many people work all the time just because, like workaholics, because it almost distracts from this kind of existential dread, according to Schopenhauer, deep inside of us that we're all very, very much aware. And so what Schopenhauer said is that you might say, well, what is the best way out of this? If life is just never going to make you happy and you're just stuck in this body that always wants stuff and never gets satisfied, what do we do, Schopenhauer? And he famously said, we should renounce the world, so we should basically be like monks, which again refutes Aristotle's philosophy of man is a political animal, humans are political animals, we need to socialize. What Schopenhauer is saying is that people always betray you, so we should avoid them. So never engage with people, because it's always a losing game. Schopenhauer used the example of card playing, and how when people play cards, they practice how to trick people, and the whole point of cards is to trick you into thinking I don't have something I have. So he said that this aspect of humanity is quite vile, and so he had a very pessimistic view of people. So we should remove ourselves from the world. So you might say, well, what are we going to do? And he said, art effectively is what redeems us. So Plato had argued that art, because it's an imitation of nature, or a painting is an imitation of something. Well, Plato argued that the physical world itself wasn't real. The idea is actually real. So Plato would say the idea of these glasses, the form of the glasses, are actually real. That's reality. These physical glasses, which will come and go and no longer exist one day, that's the world of becoming, not being. Becoming is changing, being is unchanging. So therefore, that's not knowledge. And so for Plato, we should never consume any art. We should never consume poetry. For Plato, he would say never watch movies, because it's all fake. It's fiction. It's not real. It didn't happen. And so it's not even just, oh, it's fantasy and it's a waste of time. It's the idea, if the glasses are a copy and unreal of this perfect idea of glasses, then a drawing of glasses are a copy of a copy. So for Plato, art is actually a dissension and descending down from this pure reality of ideas. So the idea, the pure idea, is true reality. Then the physical thing that is partaking in the idea is less real, and then the art is even less real than the physical thing. So as I said, the idea of the glasses is pure reality. These are a shadow copy version that aren't actually real, because they'll come and go. And so anything that comes and goes can't be truly real for Plato. It doesn't have lasting transcendental reality. It exists, but it's not real. And the drawing, if I start drawing a picture of the glasses for Plato, that's even less real. So the drawing art for Plato, all art is a copy of a copy. Schopenhauer rejects this completely and does the exact opposite. For Schopenhauer, he argued that if we look at a painting, for example, of an apple, and we're looking at this painting of an apple, we can actually contemplate the form of the apple, separate and abstracted from a physical apple. So if I have an apple in my hand, I might actually, for Schopenhauer, the will would get excited. I'll want to eat it, I'll eat it, and then I'll have a stomach ache or I'll be hungry later. So we would strive to want it because it would be our desire. It would never fulfill us and we would just go after something else. So what Schopenhauer is saying is, when you actually have the painting of the apple, you can truly contemplate, in his idea, the Platonic form of the apple. And so he had actually made art a means by which we can arrive at philosophical truths, which throughout philosophy before him was not an idea typically valued. All the way back to Plato and all the way up to Schopenhauer was this view that art was not transcendently as pure as philosophy, and that even aesthetics in philosophy didn't have as much of an important status in philosophy. Aesthetics in philosophy is the idea of what is beauty. And so what Schopenhauer said is that aesthetics in philosophy is fundamentally important because it lets us deal with the fundamental issues of the human condition. And so when we read a literary work from Thomas Pynchon, for example, Gravity's Rainbow, we can actually see how the geopolitical structure works, because through an artist's satirical positions, he can say things that he can't say in the real world. He can put forth ideas that under the safety of its fiction, it's not real, but in reality, he's actually doing social commentary, social satire, and we can actually learn more about a culture, historically speaking, when we read its fiction and its art and its literature, than the historians wrote about that actual time. The art of a particular culture reveals more about its cultural values than a historian writing about hundreds of years later. So what Schopenhauer said is that actually art gives us this knowledge. So he called it aesthetic disinterestedness. And he argued that what art allows us to do is abstract and separate our will from this phenomena that we're experiencing. So that was a fundamentally very forward-thinking idea. And this is why Schopenhauer has a tremendous appeal amongst artists, because artists are going to like that idea, of course. And so much of his life was thwarted in disappointment. There's a lot in Schopenhauer scholarship. Was his philosophy and his pessimism what led to his life outcomes, or was his life outcomes the result of his pessimism? For example, his father jumped off a roof when he was very, very young. So he inherited with his mother all of his father's money. He was very wealthy. His father was a lover of English culture, so he had sent Schopenhauer, based off, obviously his name's Arthur, an English name. He had sent Arthur Schopenhauer, his son, off to London to be educated. He even came back and his English accent was so thick that his father was even worried. So, and Schopenhauer always read the London Times all throughout his life. So there was this belief that when he was very young, he was highly expected to be an intellectual, and very early on, relative to his life, he inherited his father's fortune. So he could have just been basically a frat bro to some extent his whole life, but he decided that he would become a philosopher. So he got a PhD, he became a philosopher, and he actually had classes at the same university as Hegel. And when he put on his lectures, he did it exactly at the same time as Hegel. And at this time, Hegel was getting 100, 200 people to his lectures. He was the rock star. He was the guy everyone wanted to meet and thought was the coolest. And Schopenhauer, I believe, did 3 lectures. There was 1 or 2 that had 1 or 2 people. And then there was, I think, the 3rd one he did, nobody showed up. And he still gave the lecture. And it was at that point he said, I don't need to do this. I have enough money from an inheritance. Why am I even doing this? He said, all these people are obviously blockheads. They're not intellectual. I'm a genius. And like any true philosopher, he had that grandiosity. Because the philosopher is always going beyond the Platonic cave and seeing into the horizon. So social rejection for the philosopher is not something to distemper his spirits. It actually is something to fire him up. We know from Socrates right up to Descartes that many philosophers were not socially accepted. Descartes' writings were actually burned at one time. Even Rousseau's were as well. Descartes' were banned and Rousseau's were burned. So there's always been an element of the philosopher as being socially censured because they're always challenging the status quo. So Schopenhauer sort of did a huff and puff and said, I'm done with the academic world. So if you ever see those academics who say I'm too intellectual or too free thinking for the academic world, now they're podcast hosts, this goes all the way back to Schopenhauer. And he spent, at that point, he eventually would go to Frankfurt, where he would live for the rest of his life. And for 20 years, he just lived, they called him the Bachelor of Frankfurt, where he just lived in this apartment and wrote philosophy and worked on his philosophy for 20 years. And he eventually published, before that, The World as Will and Representation, Volume 1. 20 years later, he would publish The World as Will and Representation, Volume 2. And it's a summary of him after 20 years reflecting on his philosophy and articulating it and adding to it and having the ideas cemented in his own mind and re-articulating them. And I would actually argue to many people, the second volume is actually superior to the first. Perhaps not in literary quality, but at least in terms of the articulation of his ideas. It's actually very much clearer in some passages in Volume 2 exactly what he's saying and thinking. So basically he rejected that world, and that conformed to his own thinking. His thinking was people will be phonies, be fakes, be vipers, be serpents, and the true philosopher needs to reject the world and basically go into this kind of monastic, almost like a monk effectively, in a monastery studying and being devoted to philosophy. The idea of the will to life which he had, which is that everything in existence has this blind striving to exist, Schopenhauer argued that this is what drives us forward and this is what keeps us going. This itself, the idea of the will to life, would be the basis for Nietzsche's idea of the will to power. So when Schopenhauer wrote everything is the will to life, Nietzsche went along and just erased life and wrote power. He added that, but effectively it's this idea, both of them ground their philosophy in the will. Because the idea of a will seems to avoid the problems of idealism, where once you become purely abstract, we're now getting almost lost in our thoughts and something doesn't become kind of concrete. This was a term that Hegel actually liked a lot, the concrete. And there's an element of the will where it also avoids the pitfalls of empiricism and materialism, which is that once you reduce human existence to this kind of block, there's a passivity there, whereas the will implies a certain level of activity, not passivity. So this is why the will, both of them were intrigued by this idea. It seemed to avoid the pitfalls of idealism, and it seemed to avoid the pitfalls of materialism and empiricism, even sort of physicalist ideas. In some sense, both of them in their idea of the will would anticipate existentialism. Not so much in the Kierkegaardian sense, but more of the Sartrean sense, which was that we have this existence that we experience that is somewhat nightmarish, and it's effectively on us to come up with a system of philosophy to deal with it. And Schopenhauer's philosophy, you could argue, was in some sense a reaction to the culture in Germany at that time, which was a pure devotion to idealism. For example, Hegel could be argued to be the idealist par excellence. Hegel famously argued that matter itself was an abstraction. If we take away all our ideas of matter, all our ideas of it are basically our perceptions. We've seen something, we've heard something, we've tasted something, but we don't actually experience matter in itself. He said that is an abstraction. And so Schopenhauer wanted to get away from this idealism, which he had felt was, in many of his phrases he uses in Volume 2 of The World as Will and Representation, he says, this type of philosophy is just an empty juggling of words. So Schopenhauer said Hegelianism is just an empty juggling of words, because what Hegel did was work with the pure idea, and Schopenhauer, being influenced by Kant and Kant being influenced by the empiricists, made this distinction between a concept and an idea. And a concept is something that is rooted in our perceptions. And so what Schopenhauer said is that if you have an idea that isn't rooted in a perception, it can't be verified. Now we're getting into sort of anticipating things like logical positivism. But what Schopenhauer said is that it just becomes basically empty talk, basically nonsense is what he said. And we don't know what's actually being said to some extent, because we don't know what they're referring to, these sort of pure concepts. And this type of philosophy that Schopenhauer had to seem to reject would be very much influential in Germany, this Hegelianism and this absolute idealism. And so Schopenhauer's philosophy really was something that I think was socially not going to be very popular. And so, for example, Hegel, for example, was very much himself a religious person, but his philosophy had actually seemed to imply that God and man were becoming one through history. History itself is God and humanity becoming one. Very somewhat blasphemous if you think of it theologically, because it's a collective oneness. God and all of humanity as oneness are merging. And so Schopenhauer argued that in one of his dialogues, it's a great essay, it's called Religion, a Dialogue. Schopenhauer argued that, and it's a great dialogue, it's these two interlocutors and they're basically arguing. And one of them is arguing that philosophy is the only thing that's true and truth for truth's sake. And the other is arguing that religion, even if it isn't true, is practically necessary. So it's a very interesting idea. And I think what Schopenhauer was doing was he was essentially dialoguing with himself. And the argument is basically the philosopher is arguing philosophy is for the few and religion is for the masses. And what he says is that what is true is always what is more important than what makes people feel good or what helps them functionally or practically. And so truth for truth's sake, he even says you can't get grapes from thistles. So if you start a philosophy from a first principle that's a lie, you can only get lies. Now we're going back to the noble lie of Plato's Republic. But the character arguing for religion argues that people need an interpretation of life. And this is the counter-argument. The philosopher who's arguing for the truth for truth's sake, he argues that philosophy is for the few and religion is for the masses, and that everybody needs an interpretation of life. The Germans call it the Weltanschauung, or a worldview. So if you ever hear anybody say, what's your worldview? You might not be well versed in philosophy and know everything about Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, but you have a worldview. And so what Schopenhauer is saying is that your worldview is relative to your powers of comprehension, your intelligence. And what Schopenhauer argues is that the reason why not a lot of people do philosophy, this character in the book, in the dialogue, he's arguing that the reason why not a lot of people do philosophy is because they don't have this intellectual curiosity or capacity. And basically what he said is what religions do is they give answers to this need of an interpretation of life, but it's basically an allegorical storybook where you don't have to actually think through these first principles and it's all given to you. So basically religion is philosophy for the masses. Religion is philosophy, but it's clothed in allegory. So it's not that the truths in religion aren't true, it's just that the way it was presented is a lie. So Schopenhauer would say, yeah, like something like the Bible and its narratives would be all fake. That didn't happen, it's all a narrative, but the truths in it are actually true. And it's not that the happenings were untrue, that's just the narrative plot, that's just there to give us something to understand. Because as he said, if you try to give the whole world this lecture hall philosophical disputation about reality and morality, it's not going to work. People can't just handle the idea that, well, we understood through reason that you shouldn't do that. You need to give them basically a scary story so they don't do it again. You need to give them a cultural narrative, sort of like Peter and the Wolf. If I tell you just don't steal, you're gonna be like, I kind of want to steal. But if I create a story of a guy who stole, or sorry, if you don't, lying, Peter stealing. If I tell you don't lie, you're gonna be like, why not? But if I give you a story of a guy who lied so much that when he needed to tell the truth, no one believed him, that will make you not want to do that. So this is basically it, that we need to teach people through narrative philosophical values. We can't lecture to people because one, the people aren't intellectual enough. Two, they'll be defensive. Three, they'll say, well, I have my own counter philosophy. So basically what Schopenhauer is saying is that religion is probably not historically or practically what happened, but the values that it imparts are all philosophical. And this is where we're getting into this idea of, if something is a first principle not true, how could you get to the truth? You can also get to the idea that, and going back to Plato's noble lie, that the masses for Plato needed to be lied to for their own good. So this idea that even if a religion isn't true, down the road it could perhaps bring social benefits, social cohesion. Some would argue for sure that religion has actually divided us. But you could argue that's where there's multiple religions, where if there's just one religion, there could be more cohesion. So that's this idea that humans need something to believe in, and effectively this kind of elitist, there's many philosophers that talk about this, the masses. Montaigne mentions the herd. Plato as well constantly speaks contemptuously of the masses, because for him, they got rid of Socrates. So Schopenhauer inherits this from philosophy, this kind of idea of, I'm the philosophical genius, and they're all just, the term Schopenhauer actually used is blockheads, which is kind of a funny term. But again, it's this bitterness and this resentfulness that he was not accepted. And instead of trying to become accepted into the world, he essentially said, well, I'm just going to take out all my stuff and just say, forget all of you. I'm too much of a genius for this world, so I'm not going to try to be accepted in it. And it was only until very much at the end of his life that he was truly perceived as a great philosopher, and people started visiting him, and he would look through newspapers to find reviews of his books. So this fame that eluded him his whole life, he finally did receive it in the end. He didn't enjoy much of it, but essentially his philosophy was an attempt to take philosophy out of the lecture room and he spoke to many people that weren't necessarily philosophical, and his literary background as well truly helped him. Schopenhauer is considered by many to be, if not the greatest, like one of the greatest literary philosophers ever. Just the prose that he could produce and the writings. So even if you don't agree with his ideas, I always recommend to read his writings, because he was just a brilliant writer. And so we can often think of a philosopher as their legacy to the canon and what they contributed. Well, let's just break down what Schopenhauer contributed. In arguing for the will, he was the first philosopher to argue that we're fundamentally irrational. Guys like David Hume and even Rousseau, who argued for a kind of sentimentalism, they were arguing that we're passionate, but that's not irrational. That's saying our emotivity, our emotionalism is what pushes us forward. Whereas what Schopenhauer is saying is it's not our emotions, it's our irrationality. And it's our irrationality for Schopenhauer. The metaphor he gave, it's our will. So he said basically your existence is your reason and your will. And the reason is always subordinate to your will. So your will, he said, is like this giant, and our reason is like this little dude standing on the shoulder of the giant, whispering in the ear, saying, turn left, turn right, but the giant really wants to go. So you might be on a meal plan, and you're rationalizing to yourself, I gotta lock in and get this meal plan, but your friends are like, hey, there's McDonald's, let's just get McDonald's or whatever, and suddenly you really want to get it, and you've forgotten all this stuff. This is what Schopenhauer is saying. Schopenhauer actually, for example, didn't argue for free will. He was very much arguing that our will is very much governed. The only way we could achieve a level of freedom is to basically negate the will, to thwart the will, to renounce the will, and to basically become disinterested through art. And so this whole philosophy for Schopenhauer was leading towards what eventually Freud would develop. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis and psychology to some extent. Modern psychology with talk therapy. Freud took this idea of the unconscious straight from Schelling, actually. But really, it was the way it was articulated from Freud, it was actually from Schopenhauer as well. Freud took a lot from Nietzsche as well. He famously said he wished he was a philosopher, and he was influenced by Nietzsche. But this idea that there's an unconscious, which Freud would really articulate, was what was basically prototypically there in Schopenhauer's philosophy. He was saying, we're not as rational as we think we are. We are not these Cartesian, supreme, divine angels of reason floating in immateriality, and we have this soul that's just looking at pure things. What Schopenhauer is saying is, we have this will that's stuck in a body, and it's transcendental, and we can never truly escape what it is. It's the foundation of what we are. but we can't find this lasting happiness in that, and that itself is the whole point of life, to constantly strive for this disinterestedness, to escape the will and no longer be at its beck and call. And really, in that sense, he influenced so much in philosophy because, for example, as I mentioned earlier, Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a philologist, he had a PhD by the time he was 24. I believe he was like the youngest European to get a PhD at that time. And he was in a bookstore and he saw Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation, and he picked it up and he got it, and then he said that actually is what turned him into philosophy. So Schopenhauer's influence is very much there in terms of the intellectual legacy after him, and very much at his time reacting to everything that was there. He sort of, in that sense, is a proto-existentialist. He's not an existentialist really at all. But in terms of getting at this kind of basic experience of existence that we have, which we're not going to filter through a philosophical category, which he accused Kant of doing, he'd always basically argued that Kant was too rosy-eyed, and that he was too much of an optimist, and that the implications of Kant's philosophy, Schopenhauer said he was dealing with. And he had basically argued that was the issue with Kant's philosophy, is that he had made it too overcomplicated. He added too many categories. So for Kant, I believe there's 12 categories, and space and time are the fundamental ones. Schopenhauer argued we can get rid of those and just reduce it to causality. So what Schopenhauer argued is that we actually have a concept of causality that makes it so that we don't have this Humean nightmare. So David Hume argued that you could drop a ball 100 times, and on the 101st time it might just freeze in space. And he said everything we do when something is causing something else, for Hume, it's just correlation for David Hume. David Hume argued everything is correlation, there's no such thing as causation. There's no such thing as cause and effect. He said it's just in our mind when we see a sequence of events and a succession of events, and we call that causing it. So one ball hits another ball and it moves. Well, he said you just saw a succession of events, you didn't experience causality. And what Kant had said is that awoke him up out of his dogmatic slumber. What Kant had said is we know there's causality there because that allows for the experience in the first place. Causality as a category in our mind allows for the possibility of that ball to hit the other ball in the first place. Schopenhauer pointed out too, the problem with Hume's idea of succession is that when the day is before the night, we don't think the day caused the night. So we know just through certain experiences that we don't apply this idea of succession to things in our experience. We know through an intuition of this category of causality that this exists. So basically, Schopenhauer's philosophy was a mixture of Eastern philosophy and Kantian philosophy. And in many ways, his philosophy itself is a kind of synthesis of those two. He always said that he was most influenced by Plato, the Upanishads, Kant as well. And I think that is very much there because this idea of the world as will and representation, what he's saying is the world as the noumena, the will, is what the essence is. So the noumena is will, your will. And the representation is the world we experience, not the thing in itself. He famously said at the start of the world as will and representation, quote, "The world is my idea," unquote. And so what he's saying, he even continues, when I look up at the sky, I don't see the sun. I see the sun that my eye gives me. This idea that we're not experiencing reality, we're experiencing representation. And so Schopenhauer's philosophy was not quite received in his time, but it's essentially now canonized, and Schopenhauer is considered one of the great Western philosophers. And so I think that's pretty much, guys, what I wanted to say. And I'm not sure if that made a lot of clarity, his philosophy clear for all of you. I hope it did. But nonetheless, I'm going to be continuing making videos on this channel. It's just been a bit busy making them consistently, but I plan on making more in the future. I think the next one might be Kant, or we might do Hegel. And so I just want to thank all of you guys for being here. Thank you so much. And make sure you leave a comment, guys, about what you think about this video. Tell me if you've ever read Schopenhauer. Tell me what you think. And with that being said, thank you very much, everyone, and I hope to see you the next time I make a video.